Thanks for tuning in to the Generals Redoubt second episode of our new series, General Lee Speaking, an alumni history of Washington and Lee University. This series is all about our alma mater's unique heritage. Join us as we discuss the critical characters and events that transformed a small Scots-Irish Academy into one of the premier institutions in America. Hear from alumni, students, and professors as they share their experience and perspective on these moments, and most importantly, understand why we must instill current and future generations of generals with a passion for Washington and Lee's past. I'm your host, Cameron Spivey, recording from Fancy Hill's new podcasting studio. Hope you can visit us sometime soon. I'm joined today by a close friend of mine and soon-to-be alumnus, Drew Thompson. Many of you may know Drew from his 3-year span as editor-in-chief of the W&L Spectator. He certainly amassed quite the following from his devotion to Washington and Lee traditions, which is why I've asked him to join me today in a discussion on perhaps our university's richest tradition, the honor system. Before we go any further, Drew, can you introduce yourself and tell our listeners what's so special about W&L to you?
For sure. Well, I'm Drew Thompson. I'm originally from Richmond, Virginia. Came to W&L attracted by the small size of the school and the strong sense of community I got when I visited. I've completed a double major in economics and history along with a minor in mathematics, and I'm looking forward to going to do some economic research after graduation. Again, I think for me, right, the biggest thing about W&L is the sense of community, the culture of a school. We're smart and intelligent here, but we also enjoy kicking back and having a good time and really making the most of our years in college.
Great. Well, let's jump right into it and talk about the honor system. As we all know, traditions take time to develop and to become traditions. I think they might take less time to no longer be a tradition, and we've certainly seen a lot of traditions at W&L fade in recent years. But the honor system really seems like one that holds strong today. Students really do still appreciate that. They still abide by it. We don't have rampant cheating. And so it's a strong tradition, but it might have also changed over time. So I'd like to walk us through sort of the history of the honor system, starting with the spiritual leader, the guide to the honor system. And that's, of course, Robert E. Lee, who, when he came here as president in 1865, had brought with him 5 years of international fame as a gentleman, as a leader that people aspired to be like. Union soldiers, Confederate soldiers, it seemed like so many people admired Lee. So when Lee comes here, he sets an example of honor, what to do. His surrender at Appomattox, I think, set maybe one of the greatest examples of honor. And so he brought that with him to W&L. And the key thing that he did with the honor system, or this sort of early concept, because of course it wasn't codified at the time, it's still not codified, but even it wasn't called the honor system. One of the key things he did was put disciplinary matters within student hands. And perhaps the most famous line from all of Lee's presidency was this quote of, "We have but one rule here, and that is that every student be a gentleman." And so that's sort of the defining value that has shaped our institution for 150 years. And so I guess, Drew, before we talk to how the honor system's played out in your time, do you have any sort of thoughts about Lee's connection to it?
I mean, again, I think for me, Robert E. Lee's involvement with the school and with the honor system, I think really speaks to the idea that the W&L education is about more than just academics, right? It's an education about how to conduct yourself in a good, in a strong society. And again, right, his quote that there is but one rule, that all students should be a gentleman, right? That obviously epitomizes the holistic W&L education, and that definitely carries through.
Thinking of that reputation to your freshman orientation, you were a freshman in fall of 2021. And when I was a freshman a year before, that was fall of 2020, known for COVID and virtual learning. And so our orientation was on Zoom. It wasn't actually in Lee Chapel as it historically had been. How was your experience in fall of 2021?
I think it's immensely moving. the first year honor system orientation is a very powerful experience. You realize that you're all there together as one community, and you have this expectation that if you see somebody lying, cheating, or stealing, right, you're going to call them out for it and report it. And that's the guidelines for being in this community. And if you do those things, you accept that the consequences, if you get caught, are that you are going to leave the university. So I think all that was made very clear to us on the outset. And I think that kind of communal bond is really unmatched anywhere else.
Who was involved in that orientation?
President Dudley started off by giving a few remarks and then actually left the chapel. So it was only students who remained in the chapel. And then the president of the executive committee gave a several-minute speech going over the expectations of the honor system, why it's important for the university, some of the history behind the honor system. And toward the end of his speech, he stopped and he said, if anybody does not agree to these guidelines, you may get up and leave the chapel now. And he just stood there. Several moments of silence, and obviously kind of a very powerful moment that was nobody left in my year. But, if somebody doesn't agree to uphold that system, that's the time for them to leave the university.
Yeah, that's, I think, a pretty common experience of that speech, at least in recent years. Students I've talked to, young alumni, if you don't want to follow this, there's the door. And I imagine that's been a line that's been parroted for generations because it sticks and it sets the message across pretty clear. After that was 4 years ago now. Was that speech true? Did it uphold, all through your four years?
I think it generally has. People leave their doors unlocked here. I never locked my dorm room door at all during my freshman year. Never kept my room locked. And fraternity house, kept my house this year locked, just because I don't know who's going to come off the Chessie Trail or whatever. But those little things like that the honor system definitely enables. It makes it very clear that any kind of invasive behavior is not acceptable here. And I think sets the tone for that kind of conduct, right? There's so many things I have not had to worry about here that I would have to worry about going to a larger school. And again, that definitely has an impact. That creates a sense of belonging, a sense of, relaxation and community and trust that I think really reverberates throughout all social interactions here. In terms of academics, I think it's also still pretty strong. I don't know. I'd like to think that not many people cheat. In a way, it might be kind of a hard thing to measure. A lot of professors do have take-home exams. And, I don't know. Kind of the skeptic in me says, yeah, it's kind of hard to measure, how many people might take a glimpse at their notes when you have a take-home closed exam. But, I know I don't cheat on take-home exams, right? I adhere to professors' guidelines there. And I think, as far as I know, my peers do the same. At other institutions, it is totally out in the open that people cheat. It is very acceptable to talk about it. And at W&L, at the very least, no matter what the actual state is, right, we have a very strong taboo on talking about cheating. Nobody talks about it. If they do it, they don't talk about it. And I think, again, that still says something to me. It still says that the honor system has a lot of power here.
I want to talk more about that expectation that there's not cheating, that it's unique to W&L, right? W&L has this 1920 pamphlet that I'm holding in my hand. It's also on TGR's website, and our W&L history page describes W&L as a place like no other. No institution in America can compare with it. And it talks primarily about our namesakes and the patriotism there, but it also details the opportunity and the trust, the honor endowed with students. And that was 100 years ago. So I want to talk more about the history, the tradition that has substantiated that over time. But before we do that, let's take a quick break to hear from our first sponsor.
Hello, Alex Kagan here, editor of the W&L Spectator student newspaper. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we rely on people like you to fund our journalism, keeping all Generals up to date on campus events and news. If you would like to donate, visit our website at www.wluspectator.com, and we will send you our next print edition as our way of saying thank you. We also accept alumni and community opinions, which can be emailed to editor@wluspectator.com. Thank you for your support.
So I think one of the most iconic, memorable stories recounted annually in the orientation for freshmen because it's so memorable. In the 1950s, we had a well-performing football class that cheated on an exam, and they were brought against an honor violation before the executive committee and dismissed, and we basically ruined our football program to uphold our honor. Certainly other universities might not be doing that. Recently in the university archives, I came upon a collection of letters from the late 90s and early 2000s presidential papers that discussed the honor system, and it was a faculty survey of the honor system. A 2004 survey in which over 80% of faculty participated in, which is a pretty high performance. And it was just general questions about their view of the honor system. Was it too strict? Did students cheat in class? What were the pros and cons of it? And the overwhelming views from the professors were that they weren't worried about student misconduct. They thought students were behaving honorably, and they really had a lot of faith for the institution, particularly the professors that had been there a while. And that was now 20 years ago. And I think the same sentiments probably hold true today if you were to speak to professors. I know a lot of the professors that I had in the history department and in the classics department, we talk about just in office hours, their view of the honor system. And they tended to really like it because it gives a lot of accommodations really for the professor as much as the students. Professors don't proctor exams. Do you have any thoughts on your professors, conversations you've had about their perception of the honor system, sort of faculty perspective in 2025?
Yeah, I think I certainly do. I don't know, at least maybe half of my professors have had me pledge my work when I submit it. So to write out the honor system pledge, I pledge on my honor that I have neither given nor received any unauthorized or unacknowledged aid on this assignment. Sign my name. And again, I think that really keeps it front and center that there's an expectation that I do my work myself. I do it honorably. I follow the professor's guidelines on what resources I can use, so on and so forth. So I think it is still very much a central concept for a lot of professors that they, like to make clear to their students that they expect students to follow those standards. For other professors, maybe less so. I think you do hear about nowadays professors who might not be as willing to report things because of the single sanction. They worry about that consequence is just too severe, maybe to bring up every matter that comes before them. But I think especially professors who have been at W&L for a while still take it very seriously.
Well, it's interesting you say that some professors are concerned to report potential honor violations, right? Maybe a student writes a paper and it seems like AI was used a little too heavily. There's another story that I'm pretty fascinated by that I need to look and see if the Spectator reported on this in the 90s. But I think in 1997, there was an incident where a student at the law school was dismissed for an honor violation, and the exact circumstances of which, I couldn't glean from the writings because the EC president, who's writing letters to the university president and others at the time, emphasized that he wasn't allowed to express the conduct, which I think's really encouraging to see that even in talking to the President Wilson at the time, that, he won't break what's required of him. The incident was that there was some student at the law school in the late 90s who was dismissed for an honor violation. And for whatever complicated reasons, the university sort of dropped the ball for not making the student physically leave campus. And so he stayed on campus and had a week or two to malign the executive committee and the honor system. And it was a really controversial thing for the college, and it resulted in a public forum among the law students at the law school. But the law professors, they sort of hijacked the event and made a claim that the honor system was problematic, that the student was not given due process, he couldn't have legal counsel, all of these sort of components that you could imagine law professors, lawyers might have concerns about, because there's not the same liberties that there are in the American justice system. And I think that's fair to point out, but certainly we sort of hold ourselves to a higher standard. Then there was a letter written by a law professor, and this was just published on TGR's website and on the Spectator's website as a historical highlight. from a law professor who accused the honor system of being discriminatory, that she was confident it had all these problems, but namely of those was that it's used to selectively out certain individuals. And this is a claim that I've heard parroted for many years. My freshman year, there was a lot of emphasis during the change the name debates by people claiming that the honor system was used to sort of kick out Black students in the early 70s and to really keep this homogenous student body. And that's a common claim. You may have heard it yourself, Drew, in your time here. But I was really impressed by President Wilson's response. And again, you can read the exact quote, but he basically says well, first off, he was shocked that such allegations could even be made. And he expressed his disappointment that this professor would challenge the honor system. But then he said, you make sort of a baseless claim about its discriminatory use. And I guess using his power as president of the university, he did some digging and compiled all of the students who had been dismissed in the last 5 years or so. And I think there were maybe 25 people or something. And he broke down and said, of this many were white and only this many were Black. Almost all the people dismissed were in Greek life. Very few were not in Greek life. Most were men, not women. And so he made the point that whatever group you're identifying as being selectively targeted, there's no evidence to support that. And I think that that's a fair assumption to make generally with the honor system, that today I don't think it's being used to target and discriminate against certain groups of individuals.
I mean, I don't really sympathize too much with those allegations. I think generally the executive committee, the people I've known who have been on that, take what they do very seriously and try to discharge their duties in a very non-biased manner as much as possible from any justice system. What I think might be a little more interesting, you could have some arguments about the culture of the school, right? Like you have a lot of people here, and this is true in my case, who might go to a small private school for their high school education and already have drilled in them expectations of honor. I mean, my high school had a honor system, right? I was president of the honor council at my high school, right? So I came into W&L already having some of these expectations. And maybe you have some students who have a different experience during high school and they don't come in with that same sense of the culture of honor and, how to conduct themselves. I don't really think that excuses different behavior because we make the expectations very clear here.
What do you think of President Wilson's response then? And you haven't read the letter, of course, but it was a pretty succinct and stern condemnation of what was claimed, basically this making unsubstantiated claims against something that you know very little about. What was also interesting, and this is why archives are so valuable in general, is that in this folder of presidential papers, there were like 5 or 6 drafts of this letter that he wrote. It was an email chain back and forth, but they had his personal handwritten draft of the letter, which was then typed up and multiple variations. So this was clearly something he thought a lot about and how he would respond to her. So clearly it meant a lot to him. And he could have certainly just ignored it as I think some presidents might have done.
Again, I think he's exactly in the right to respond the way he did. I think it's good that he was able to find some kind of hard data to back up his claims. It's interesting because that is something people wanted to track in some of the amendments to the White Book that were under consideration last year, is essentially preparing reports for the student body on the demographic makeup of people who have been accused and convicted or accused and acquitted of honor violations, which was shot down. There's some privacy concerns there. So it's kind of interesting that, he was able to get that data. And, again, I think it speaks to, the expectations are very clear when people get here of how you should conduct yourself.
So that, I guess, training, sort of continuing education, we'll call it, of the honor system, I think is really important. It would, of course, impact the legitimacy or the sort of importance of the honor system if people don't know about it. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on the student body's responsibility.
Yeah, I certainly think you could point out there are so many positions for the EC that go uncontested.
For some where you have nobody at all.
That's exactly right. And maybe that speaks to, apathy from the students, which I think it's generally my sense, but at the same time, right, it could also speak to that people are concerned about it, right? That they feel that it is in a good place, right? If they felt like the EC was doing a horrible job and, completely off the rails, I think 2020 is, a good example of that, where, my understanding is that the EC essentially, through the leadership of the executive committee, harangued its members into passing a motion condemning the name of the school and saying that the school should change its name. But my understanding is that after that, there was kind of a conservative flush of the EC, it was a very conservative executive committee. The next year, I had a friend who was on it the following year. The dynamic kind of changed pretty drastically.
There was also an explicitly progressive ticket that ran for that next cycle, running in, I guess, the spring of 2020 for the next year, what would have been your freshman year, on an explicitly progressive, get rid of the single sanction. This school has, a really bad history ticket, and there were 3 people, and I think all 3 of them lost. And so I guess that goes along. There was definitely a conservative flush that pushed out some of those more progressives.
Exactly. And I think generally the EC during my time here has remained somewhat conservative. So, I think in a way, some of the apathy towards it could also just be, okay, we're in decent hands. The people who are running this have kind of self-selected into it for good reasons that we agree with. In a given year, I've generally known, at least a little bit about 3 or 4, maybe 5 people on the EC. I mean, this past year, I knew pretty much everybody on the EC in some personal capacity. So I don't know, like in a way, you see those people running and okay, yeah, clearly they've got this. I don't really need to step in. I mean, last year for the class of 2025 position, they had trouble getting to somebody to run for it. And they had sent out multiple emails. We need somebody to run for this. If you're interested, we're going to extend the deadline. And the day I got that email, I'd started thinking, oh, should I throw my hat into the race? If somebody needs to do this, right, this could be my chance to kind of serve and give back and, uphold this strong sense of community. And I got a message from a good friend of mine who said, oh, I'm running, support me. I said, okay, well, clearly this is in good hands, so I'm not going to worry about it. And he ended up winning. Yeah, I think the same thing goes with the White Book Review Committee. I mean, there was, some decent turnout during, I guess, a few of their committee meetings. One of them I went to, I was the only one who showed up from the public to comment. But the other session I went to, there were more people there. So kind of a mixed bag. If anything, I think it's a sense of complacency that maybe we've gotten into, and that might be a little bit concerning, right? If something's working well, it's important to complement it, make sure it continues in its present form. So I think it's important to be vigilant and watch out for various reformist forces that, might try to upend everything. But I think so far, the conservatives on campus have been paying enough attention to realize when that might happen and when they need to step in and, come up with some good arguments to defend the status quo.
The Spectator has been really strong on pushing the honor system and reporting on these things, right? You did it last year with the proposed amendments. And the year before that, there was, if you recall, the controversy of one of the EC members being removed from office and some weird issues of the public minutes being redacted and a lot of controversy. And so we reported on that. I was actually in Athens, Greece at the time, writing an article and calling a journalism professor at 3 a.m. Athens time. Super important stuff that we were getting out, trying to report on this because people were really concerned about it. I think that was one of our largest articles that year in terms of reader base. I guess it's fair to say that students, even if they are not super engaged in the day-to-day processes of it, not going in high numbers to forums, when there is something that comes up, some sort of issue, they get involved and there's interest. So I guess you just need those watchdogs to keep it in mind. But that brings up a good transition to another concern of the honor system that I hear alumni express a lot that's changed since they were students. Before we get to that, let's hear from our next sponsor.
Are you enjoying this discussion of the honor system and the rich traditions of Washington and Lee? If so, could you consider donating to the Generals Redoubt today? Our 6th annual fund ends on June 30th, and we need all the help we can get to develop our campus initiatives and safeguard the historic values of our alma mater. To learn more about our mission and how to donate, visit www.thegeneralsredoubt.us. Thank you for your support, and go Generals.
One of the concerns that was expressed in some documentation I found from the 90s in some correspondence between the President Wilson and President Elrod era. This was a survey sent out to former trustees and alumni. Clearly, there was a high presidential interest in the honor system and making sure it was popular because it's a big draw for the school. But one of the concerns that was expressed in the 90s, and I think if it was expressed then, imagine how heavy it would be now, is that the sort of bureaucratization of disciplinary matters at W&L has sort of subtracted from the weight of the honor system, the all-encompassing nature of it. Historically, right, the adage is lying, stealing, and cheating. Obviously, it's never codified, but if you do something that's not honorable, then you might say if you do something that Robert E. Lee wouldn't do, then that's an honor violation. But in the 90s, you get the interfraternity council, all the sort of Greek regulatory stuff that starts capping down on hazing, which is now, I guess, outlawed in the state of Virginia. And there's a lot more litigation that goes into it. There's Title IX that develops that removes sexual misconduct to a legal bureaucratic entity that has a specific Title IX coordinator. And I don't know whether that's, good or bad, but it's a different process, right? If somebody is reported for sexual assault, it's not the executive committee that handles that. During COVID, if they weren't wearing their masks when they were supposed to, or if they were assembling in groups of 10 people or more, it wasn't the executive committee that handled that. It was the Student Judiciary Committee, the SJC. And with that, it seems, as some critics have levied, sort of stripped the executive committee of their power and given more power to the administration. Notably, the student activities has oversight over the SJC. Title IX is, an official department within the university. And so students have, in comparison to 100 years ago, have unquestionably lost this sort of self-governance that they had. For better or for worse, I don't know. But do you have any thoughts on that, any observations on that sort of bureaucratization from the 90s to today even?
Yeah, I think you kind of have to take it point by point. I mean, the Title IX stuff, that is very tricky for, a number of reasons, and, might actually be best for the institutional integrity of the honor system and of the executive committee to not have that under their purview. I mean, again, just so, a lot of legal reasons that it's problematic to have that fall under them. And if you end up in a situation where, they fumble on a sexual assault case or whatever, that could really negatively impact their standing in the eyes of the community, impact their status as an institution on campus, so on and so forth. So I think that might be one area where it's good that they aren't involved. Same with probably some of the hazing stuff too, especially as that has become, increasingly something on the legal and criminal side. I think on a number of the other issues, it's also good that they're not as involved with. I mean, you mentioned the masking stuff. I don't know. I mean, pretty instantly in my eyes, if the executive committee went about trying to enforce mask mandates, that would pretty instantly shred its credibility, even in my eyes. Like that, it's just, it's already a rule that few people agree with. I mean, I never really agreed with it. And that it would be dragging the EC through the mud to make them enforce that kind of thing. So in other words, they've stuck to the high road. They've stuck to what's most important, perhaps, at this school by limiting their purview. And I think that has actually helped them as an institution overall. There are certainly other areas, I think especially in terms of managing student life at the university, that maybe they could have held on to a little bit more authority. It seems like even in just the past few years, they've lost a lot of power over student organizations. Student activities is really increasing their oversight of all that, which used to be fully funded by the executive committee and regulated by them. I think that's an area that is of concern to me. But again, right, imagining what would have happened if they had to enforce the COVID regulations that people didn't agree with anyway. Didn't seem like there was particularly much student input on those regulations, right? It'd be one thing if the EC itself came up with those regulations, enforced them. I think it would have degraded the EC immensely to have to do that kind of stuff that people just don't agree with on a fundamental social level, right? I mean, those issues were very divisive.
Yeah, and I think part of the bureaucratization of some of these matters are just they're sort of inevitable because society has become more bureaucratized in the last century. And in the 1920s, the president of the university, Henry Louis Smith, who was really popular for his advice for young men, he had this series of these bulletins he would produce, and they would be given to students. They were sort of used as promotional material for the university and mailed out to potential students throughout the country. And he had one bulletin that he did on the honor system, one of several that the Generals Redoubt recently reproduced. If you'd like a copy of it, just visit our website and request it from our swag page. But it's called The Honor System in Theory and Practice. And this came out in 1922. And in it, he made a point that the university was unique for two things in particular relating to the honor system: the libraries, and how at our university, Washington and Lee, in the 1920s, we have all these books that you don't have to check out. You can just take them as long as he wishes. And this, as he says, this goes on day and night, the whole session, the only guardian of these thousands of costly volumes being the atmosphere and habits of the honor system. So it's sort of a self-sustaining process that the students make sure students check out books. And generally, that's still the case. We have some pretty valuable antiquarian books, particularly in the Civil War section, which is home to a lot of W&L students, that are just on the shelf for you to check out and take home. But a bulk of those items, the most valuable of our books, are now in the archives. And you have to only use those when you're supervised. You can't take them home. And that's for the best. You know, we don't want people taking signed George Washington letters home. In the 1920s, there was no archives department. There were just boxes in the president's office and the treasurer's office. But there's another feature in this pamphlet from the 1920s that President Smith talks about, and that's this long forgotten piece of university tradition called the YMCA candy store. Have you ever heard of this, Drew?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, I'd only heard about it when I first saw one of these pamphlets, but it was really popular at the time. It was basically Coop. It was just like a candy store, and they actually called it the student co-op. And it was, as it describes here, this self-service or self-serve honor system candy store with its open cash drawer, but no clerk, treasurer, or guardian, was the wonder of visitors several years ago, and was widely written up in the national magazines. So it was like a late 19th century, early 20th century. But even by 1922, this candy shop no longer exists. And basically, it was just self-managed. The funds went to fund athletics. I can imagine alumni of the 1900s, the 1890s coming and reminiscing about that candy store where they could get their chocolates without having to have somebody check them out. And of course, now if you go to get chocolate at W&L, you have to swipe and use your Flex dollars or a Mill Swipe. There's somebody that takes the card. It's more processed. In a way, that sort of feature of the honor system's gone, but it's not destroy the honor system by any means, right? Like it's been over a century. We've moved beyond that. It's just fascinating to me to think of how at one point you could sort of just go around, buy things yourself. We had that trust. And I think generally we still have that trust in students. So I don't know, maybe the call is just to bring back the YMCA candy store.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up. I actually had a friend who pointed out to me recently that there is now a security camera installed in the co-op. You know, I guess maybe they've had issues with shoplifting or whatever, but I don't really think so. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you could bring back this 100% bring back this candy store and it could operate without loads of theft. It's a shame that that's no longer around. But yeah, you know, this friend brought up the camera and again seemed to use that as an example to suggest that maybe there is some mistrust of whether or not students actually follow the honor system on the part of administrators and so on and so forth, which I think could be concerning.
Well, and it could always just be one bad apple ruins the bunch, right? I mean, I lost a pair of Ray-Bans. I say lost, they were stolen during the student activities fair 2 years ago. My friend, freshman year, during like the first week of classes, her AirPods were stolen. In my freshman dorm, we had a sort of communal money drop that if we found money lying around town, we would add it to this. And we had all agreed at the end of the academic year, we would all sort of pull straws or something. And whoever won, they'd get the amount of money to donate to whatever nonprofit they wanted. And over the course of the the semester, it had gained to be like $150 some. It would just randomly money would be added to it. After winter break, that was gone. So I don't know if a student took it or a janitor took it or somebody randomly just walked in and took it. So there's always issues. And I'm sure there was theft at Washington and Lee University in 1910 and in 1865. I know there was an issue during Lee's presidency of one of the students' firewood was stolen. And so he hollowed out the log and put some gunpowder in it so that whoever would light it would be discovered by the explosion. And the janitor is in a professor's office lighting logs, and it blows up in the office. Nobody's hurt. And so, the student comes forward and explains what happened. And Lee is said to have remarked to the student, next time, use less gunpowder. We don't have firewood stolen today. But if the majority of the community lives honorably, I think that system operates well. What I want to close on, though, is sort of what it means to follow the honor system. Historically, and I think still today, it should mean this, that to follow the honor system is to live honorably, to be an honorable person. And that I don't know today among the student body if that's really as emphasized explicitly. I think it really, more than anything, honor system, you think of academic integrity. Don't cheat, don't plagiarize. Even that, I think, is emphasized somewhat less than it used to be, because I know most professors I had didn't make you pledge your exam or your paper. Sometimes professors would say, just write the word pledged, which sort of, I think, reduces the concept of writing out the pledge. And so I guess just thinking of what the honor system means today, is it still that Washington and Lee students are living honorably, or are they just good students? And what's the goal? How do we fix it? And if you have any concluding thoughts on that, Drew.
I guess I'd point to what I said earlier, that we still have, conduct in the community, a mode of social relations that is only possible when people do live honorably. However, I do think the kind of concept of honor is perhaps maybe a little bit less all-encompassing as it used to be, especially in terms of, the idea of being a gentleman. I think that's definitely something that the school is kind of, I don't really want to say retired, because I think there are a lot of people here that still consider that very important. Certainly when I was learning about the school, when I was deciding whether to come here, that's definitely something that stood out to me, This is not just an academic education. It's about a little bit more than that. However, again, I'm not sure if everybody shares that goal when they come here, and that perhaps is a bit concerning to me, That you do definitely have divergence in values among students, divergence in goals of why you're here. And some of that might be a bit inevitable when you're living in a multicultural society. Not everybody is coming from the South. Not everybody has, maybe a more antiquated Christian way of understanding how society should work and how you ought to conduct yourself in society. And I think even the school itself doesn't lean into the kind of character side of our education as much as it used to, That this is something that, exactly to your point, should extend beyond just academic honesty. So I think I would put actually a lot of fault on administrators, on professors for not, and even students for not emphasizing the broader life lessons that you might learn while you're at college that go beyond just academic performance, academic conduct. I think there might be a little bit more need for that kind of mentoring to go on here. We have some of those values in our mission statement, and I think maybe we've fallen a bit short of the kind of more values-based side of that.
Yeah, well, the best way, I think, to secure that character lesson, that the values of Washington and Lee, it's not among the faculty or the students. I think it's the responsibility of the alumni to really advance that mission, because it's the alumni, and that will be you in a month, that can reflect on their time at W&L and how the honor system shaped the rest of their life, It wasn't just that you didn't cheat on an econ exam. It's that the principles learned, the lessons learned, the person that you become for this 4-year period shapes the way that you go into the professional world, that you start a family, that you the character stays with you. And that's what, in all of the research I've done in the history of the honor system, in alumni magazine articles written during the 30s and in more recent surveys done in the 90s and early 2000s, and even alumni that I talked to today, they emphasize that the best thing about W&L is that it produces students that are honorable, that have integrity, that have character, that is what you need in life, right? Regardless of what profession you're in, we need people like that. And so it's the alumni that I think make the honor system. Even though it's a student-led system, it's the alumni that defend it. It's the Spectator opinion articles from alumni that say, hey, I was on campus and I was concerned that this thing happened, right? That didn't seem very honorable to me. And that causes the reaction. That causes the current students to think, to reflect on it. And so I guess my parting advice is that if you're an alumnus and you're listening and you're concerned about the honor system and you want it to be as strong as it was when you were here, then speak up, make a difference, and, tell students why it's important to you. That really goes a long way.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Again, one of the reasons I wanted to come here is I had met a number of alumni of W&L and had always been impressed by the sense of character I got from them, the sense of, responsibility and seriousness. And again, really gentlemanliness that I felt when I was in their presence. So that alumni brand really matters. And the expectations for students, like what should you be like when you're a finished product of this institution? What are the expectations there?
Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Drew. And if you're listening to this and you enjoyed the conversation, please tune into next month's episode as I speak with another alumnus on the history of Washington and Lee traditions, particularly those inspired by President Robert E. Lee. Thanks again for being here, Drew, and good luck after graduation. I'm your host, Cameron Spivey, looking forward to generally speaking with you soon.